Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we have a real treat. We get to talk with Michael Mccall, who was the United States ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. And he's now a professor at Stanford and the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Good morning, Michael. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
Good. All right. I have two questions for you. I know you say we can only spend half an hour, and I have 100,000 questions I'd like to ask you. But let me ask you, as an informed person who probably couldn't tell me this if you actually knew the answer, but I'll ask it anyway. Can anybody stop Putin? Is there anybody with his entourage who might be interested in trying to constrain this man if he wants to do something even more destructive than he's doing now? This war was bad enough, but he might use a nuclear weapon. Or right now, for example, today there's talk. The head of the IAEA says that the Zaporizhia plant is out of control and they better send some experts in as an emergency. Suppose he doesn't do it. Suppose he just decides let it go. Is there anybody who can stop this man?
That's a big, hard question, and I don't have an easy answer. If I were making a list, I would say the person that's most likely to stop him is President Zelensky of Ukraine. And stopping him, for me, means stopping his invasion and the progress that his army is making inside Ukraine. Tragically, I don't see another way to bring the war to an end. It's the way a lot of wars end, by the way. Either one side wins or there's a stalemate on the battlefield. So that's nothing unique to this situation. Mm-hmm. But you're implying a second question that's harder. You're right about, is there anybody inside his government, right? A general, a former KGB guy. And I don't think so. I used to know his entourage, his inner circle pretty well. That was my job, was to meet with them and to interact with them. Obviously, I used to interact with President Putin too. And the structure of that regime today, not 20 years ago, by the way, it was very different 2 decades ago. But today there's one guy at the top, President Putin. Everybody around him owes their fortunes or their position to him. He understands that. He set that up over many, many years. So there's not a lot of autonomy with respect to the people within his government, and most certainly not within economic society, right? I think there's a lot of false hope expressed in the West. Let's sanction the oligarchs, the rich business people in Russia. And then they will get mad and they'll go to Putin and say, stop your war so that I can get my yacht back. That's not the way their system works. Those closely around him who have been enriched by him, say the head of the oil company there, Rosneft, that's a good example. The head of that, his name's Igor Sechin. I met Igor Sechin in the spring of 1991. So when I met Vladimir Putin, in fact. So I've followed his career for a long time. He's not the CEO of the Russian oil company because he's a business person or he's figured out how to make state-owned companies profitable. He's the CEO because Putin appointed him into that job. So he doesn't have any leverage vis-a-vis Mr. Putin to say, stop this war. And then there's a second category of oligarchs. They're mostly the people that made their money in the 90s. They get a lot of attention in the American press. Because they're the ones whose yachts are being seized and they're on the sanctions list. And by the way, rightly so, in my view. I think I have nothing against that action in terms of the U.S. government or the Canadian government or the EU. By the way, the Canadians are usually leading the charge on all of this. Maybe we'll get back to that in a minute. But I think there's a misconception about their political influence over Mr. Putin. He actually doesn't care about these people. He's happy to see their yacht seized. And the idea that they're going to leverage him or influence him to stop the war, or even in a more grave situation like you talked about, suggested to not use nuclear weapons. Tragically, I think those are decisions that Putin himself will make.
Well, there was a time when this guy, Stanislav Petrov, refused to obey orders and saved the rest of us. We're alive today because of him. It just plain wouldn't do what he was told. Now, when I was going to Russia long ago, back even before Gorbachev's day, I found I was being invited by the Soviet Peace Committee, and we would just sit at the table and we'd have these conferences. They acted as if I had some influence or something. But anyway, they would give their regular line, but then we'd go for coffee and they say, yeah, keep it up. That's right. And so I found that within the party, there was a huge component of people who were really on our side, but didn't want to show it at the time. I called those guys termites. And in fact, of course, Gorbachev turned out to be the leading termite. Now, is there anything that you have discovered where wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we in Putin's entourage really are on your side and we'll do what we can eventually to get you there?
Again, another tough question that I don't have an easy answer to. I think the history that you hinted at, including your own history, is an important lesson. I think we now know in retrospect that those kinds of contacts between non-governmental organizations, academics, especially the nuclear scientists during those periods, did have an influence, and they helped end the Cold War. They helped for everybody to calm down, and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we came close to nuclear war, on both sides there were more rational people that said we need to figure out ways to avoid these worst case scenarios, and we developed some crisis management, crisis prevention mechanisms, sometimes through the government, sometimes through these non-governmental channels. And I think there are important lessons for us to learn from that period. By the way, both for managing our relations with Russia today, but also for China today, because the Chinese don't know those lessons. And I'm thinking about, what's happening around Taiwan right now. We should go back and learn those lessons from the Cold War. They were important mechanisms that helped avoid catastrophic disaster, and in some channels of communication really helped for breakthroughs with regards to ending the Cold War, the nuclear arms agreements that started during that time and continued until the last one that we did. I was part of that team, the New START Treaty. Those are important lessons to relearn because I think we've forgotten them. Mm-hmm. Number two, with respect to Russia today, I am nervous that we don't have much connectivity with the Russian government and with Russian society, even compared to when I was ambassador a decade ago. You can agree to disagree. And most certainly I had many meetings with the Russian government where we spent most of it disagreeing. But what we can't have happen, and what I'm worried about, because we don't have much interaction these days, is a crisis that spins out of control because of misperception, because of misunderstanding. When I was ambassador, I used to say to my team all the time, we're going to have disagreements with the Russians, and our job is to manage them. But we can't have disagreements based on bad information or misperception. Mm-hmm. And I worry today that because there's so little interaction, Vladimir Putin himself is quite isolated today. He's, because even before COVID, he was very isolated. He didn't spend a lot of time in Moscow. He spent most of it out at his house. But since COVID, he's been even more isolated. That worries me. And military to military dialogue, intelligence to intelligence dialogue. Those were things we learned to do at earlier phases that we're not doing now, and we should be doing more of those things today. To your termite metaphor, that's a great one. I would say, again, I'm on the sanctions list. I was on the sanctions list starting in 2014. So after going to Russia and the Soviet Union pretty much every year from 1983 to 2014, I obviously haven't been back in 8 years' time. I think your listeners might be surprised at how many times I do interact with Russians, including those close to the government, sitting out here in Palo Alto because of those long-standing relationships I have. And my impression, but I want to emphasize it's an impression, it's not a scientific statement, is that there's very, very few people in Russia today that think this war was a good thing. Maybe Putin does.
Really?
Maybe Putin does.
Oh.
But most of his government do not. Most certainly none of the economic elites do. They think it's a huge disaster that will have long-term negative consequences for the Russian economy. And I mean decades of negative consequences, not just the short-term sanctions. Does the Russian military support it? I doubt it. I think that if you read in the tea leaves, this was an assessment about this was going to be a cakewalk and they were going to greet us with liberators. In my country, this reminds me of things we heard in the run-up to the war in Iraq. That intelligence assessment turned out to be radically wrong. And you hear some blaming between the intelligence services on the one hand and the military on the other. The Russian military has taken devastating losses. They are not performing the way they were supposed to, according to what looked like on paper. And remember, if you're a general in Russia before this war, you've been enjoying massive spending over the last 2 decades under Vladimir Putin's rule. Those were good times for you. And you fought these little wars every now and again, right? The Georgia 2008, Ukraine 2014, Syria with the Air Force 2015, and those were wins for you, but with not facing very challenging opponents. This war is very different. They're facing a real army with real capacity, with real will to fight. And if you're a Russian general, this is not bringing any glory. And by the way they're fighting it too is also not bringing glory. Ukrainians attack military arsenals, they attack arms depots. Russians are attacking civilians. Okay, publicly they have to say this is what we have to do. I don't know of a real soldier that really that wants to actually attack civilians. So I don't think it's very popular in the elite Russian military. Mm-hmm. And then in society, I would say this is hard to measure and, take opinion polls with a grain of salt.
Levada's last halfway trustworthy group would say 75% or 80% favor Putin's moves.
Yeah, well, let's break that down a little bit. I know Levada well. I've worked with all the polling agencies. Yuri Levada was a friend of mine before he passed away. You know what they're not telling you? All the respondents who are not responding to their polls. I hear through my circles, it could be as high as 80%. So if 80%, when they get the message in the poll, are saying not responding, you're only getting a sample of those that want to respond. Mm-hmm. And we know from our own polling here in the United States, that's why our polling firms keep missing the Trump voters, because the Trump voters say, we don't want to respond to your polls. So we need to be very careful when we looked at those numbers. If 80% are literally hanging up the phone or not answering the email, that's a pretty skewed poll. That's number one. Number two, just to remind everyone that Russia is a police state. Everybody knows that their phones and their emails are being reviewed. When you get a call or an email or an internet message from somebody in Moscow and you're out there, in Vladivostok, and a complete stranger in a society with zero trust from Moscow means Putin in their minds, mm-hmm. calls you up and say, what do you think of the special military operation? And you know that you can go to jail, 15 years in jail, just by using the word war. There's only one rational response to that. Why would you go out of your way to express disapproval? That's a very dangerous thing that you would be doing. So I just think there's a lot more quiet opposition to what's going on. It's not like they hate the sanctions too, by the way. Let's be clear. They're very upset at Americans right now. I feel that every day. And they feel like we are unjustly sanctioning them for things that they had nothing to do with. because they live in an autocracy. But enthusiasm for the war, I think, is actually pretty low. And here's one more data point, just to think about. And by the way, we do know, I used to do polling in Russia, and I'm a consumer of it to this day. There is a really clear pattern of who supports Putin and who doesn't, even before the war, which is to say, the more educated you are, the more urban place you live, the richer you are, and the younger you are, the more likely that you don't support Putin and you don't listen to his television programs talking about the war. By the way, that's a pattern we see in the United States as well. Whereas the more rural voters, the more less educated, older, poor, those are the people that do support the war. We know that to be true. Pretty robust data about that.
Support the war. Oh, I thought you were going to talk about supporting Trump.
Well, that's the same. It's the same correlation. It's actually the demographics of Trump voters and Putin's voters are actually quite similar. But two things I would say. Sorry,
but that's so ironical because Trump is like a pet dog of Putin's. So the idea that these people support the war is against Russia is bizarre. I mean, there's cognitive dissonance there, isn't there?
Wait, maybe I wasn't clear. They support Putin's war against Ukraine.
Okay.
Yeah, I was speaking too fast there. I want to be clear. So they support Putin, but their demographics, Putin's electorate looks a lot like Trump's electorate, very similar. Within that, though, it's important to think about, well, who's really active and who's not. And I would encourage your listeners to go look at the number. I don't have them off the top of my head, but those that actually watch Russian state television, it's like 20 million or so. It's a big number, by the way. 20 million is a big number. But then go look at Alexei Navalny's YouTube stations. You know how many people watch that? About 20 million. Yeah. So when I hear that all Russians are supporting Putin, and I then go and look up the numbers for Navalny's channels. To watch Navalny's channel in Russia, one, it takes a VPN. Two, it takes, you have to be nervous about that. And yet millions of Russians are tuning into Navalny's team and not the Russian state television. It suggests to me it might be a little more complex than in the conventional wisdom states.
Fascinating. You were unique in getting under Putin's skin, I think. At least when you were the ambassador, I was always hearing about how much he hated you. And I don't know, you say you're persona non grata, or you couldn't visit Russia. Is that true of other former ambassadors and diplomats? Or did you just really have a particular bad relationship with him?
Well, I didn't have much of a relationship with him. I want to be clear about that. Ambassadors don't have relationships with presidents of Russia.
Yeah, but he obviously didn't like you. There were all kinds of signs of that.
Well, but let me explain it. I arrived as a U.S. ambassador in January of 2012. Right as there were massive demonstrations inside Russia to protest a falsified vote that the entire world, including my boss at the time, Secretary Clinton, says was not a free and fair election. And so when I arrived, right when that was happening, Vladimir Putin and his propaganda channels said that people were protesting against that election because they were supported by Barack Obama, President Obama, Secretary Clinton, and me. And that was my fate. It was additionally complicated by the fact that some of the people that were leading those demonstrations were friends of mine from 20 years ago. Boris Nemtsov being one of the most important figures at the time. He was later assassinated. And so they thread that together, and then they talked about the fact that I knew Boris Nemtsov, and that was why they attacked me. And it is true that our administration, the Obama administration, I want to make sure people understand, you don't go to Moscow as the U.S. ambassador and just pop off on Twitter about your personal point of view or get on TV and say, this is what I think. No, I represented the United States of America, President Obama. I'd worked for him for 3 years at the White House before I was ambassador. The State Department, we had one policy. We didn't have a Mccall policy versus the rest. But when there were human rights abuses inside Russia, it was our policy to speak out against them. And Putin didn't like that. And, that was my job. And that, that was my fate, that I had to, endure his attacks. I would say, because I did hear from people in the West, sometimes some other ambassadors, and they would say, Mike, you're overreacting. Putin's not such a bad guy. That Navalny guy, he deserves to go to jail. Pussy Riot, they got 2 years in prison. Why are you speaking out about that? Let's just try to keep calm about Vladimir Putin. And some people in my country blamed me personally for the breakdown in U.S.-Russian relations. And I would just remind people that was a decade ago. And long after I left Moscow, that's when Putin invaded Ukraine. That's when he used his air force to bomb innocent civilians in Syria. That's when he intervened in our elections in 2016. 2018, he tried to kill Mr. Skripal in the UK. And then this year, he invaded in this catastrophic tragedy for the world, Ukraine. Those are all events that happened well after the things I was talking about. So the idea that somehow I was responsible for that, tragically, there are a lot of other events that happened.
At any rate, you certainly got vindicated. He did a favor to, if you wanted to be proved right, he certainly helped you. Yeah. But But
I didn't answer your one question. To the best of my knowledge, there was an ambassador before me that was kicked out of the Soviet Union. That's persona non grata. When he said something about comparing Nazi Germany to Stalin's Soviet Union, and he was asked to leave the country. His name was George Kennan, a rather famous man.
Oh, wow. Kennan was kicked out? I didn't know that.
In 1950. For something he said on the tarmac in Berlin, criticizing Stalin. I think I'm the only other U.S. ambassador going all the way back to John Quincy Adams. He was our first ambassador that has been put on the sanctions list, but they've just released some new sanctions. So maybe some of my former colleagues have now joined me. I don't know for sure.
Okay. Well, insofar as our networks overlap, and they do a little bit, I mean, it's not only academic. I've worked with people that are friends of yours, but also the fact that I hang out with dissidents. That's just the way I am. So I know a lot of Russian dissidents and a lot of Ukrainians as well. And I know that those people know you because they have been invited to Stanford to various workshops or visiting things or other that you have hosted over the years. So my impression is that you are sympathetic to people who want a more radical rule of law and would like to would do away with the current policy of declaring it immoral and illegal and everything else bad if one country supports a group of people in another country. For example, I think this whole rule about we should not be allowed to assist dissidents in Russia or any place else that need dissidents. I think that we ought to work to overcome that and globally, not just that the Russians do it, but on the books anyway. The U.S. has a similar law, although it's not as imposed as radically. I think we ought to do away with that and try to encourage more support or more opportunities for people in one country to support people in another. What's your take on that? I've already told you now mine.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. So one, you're right. I run a large research institution here at Stanford. It's about 500 people, by the way. It's a big operation. And we work on many things. We work on global health, climate change, cyber technology, nuclear weapons. But we have one of our centers. It's called the Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. That tries to understand the relationship between those three things, right? So first and foremost, as an academic institution, our mission is to understand the world and explain it, and then teach our students about it. So that's our first thing we do. But in addition, we do have a kind of applied mission statement to the place I run, FSI, Freeman Spogli Institute, which is to try to translate scientific knowledge into policy outcomes. And we do that through a lot of modalities. So sometimes we have our people go work in the government, like I did. That's a way to translate academic ideas into policy. Other times we try to publish things to reach broader publics and appear in places that to get our ideas out in broader publics. But we also have this training mission that you hinted at. In fact, one of the reasons I have to jump off right now is right now it's called the Draper Hill Summer Fellows Program, where we bring and we had to go online during COVID, of course, but this is for the first summer after 3 years, we're in person. And this year we have 31 activists, small d Democrats, I call them, from all over the world, not just Russia, but literally all over the world. They come together for 3 weeks. And our sessions today are about the problems in American democracy. By the way, they're offering some advice to us how we can improve our democracy. Those that have experiences with getting support for people to believe that elections are free and fair. That's a big challenge we have here in the United States. We have some things we can learn from other countries on that front. But the idea is let's learn from each other. But also to bring them together so that they can learn from each other. They don't need Stanford professors to do that. They learn in conversation with each other. So that to me, whether it's assistance, I call it education, but I philosophically agree with you that I'm a citizen of the world. I'm an independent person. Doesn't matter what the color of my passport. On my reading list here at Stanford, I don't just include authors from the United States. That would be absurd. We don't do that. And I think it would be absurd for other countries to try to limit knowledge that way. And so I do think solidarity between those that share have shared values is a norm that we should all aspire to. And I want to very consciously say it has to be a two-way street. I want small d Democrats from Kenya and Belarus and Tunisia and Nigeria. Those are just a few of the countries we have here today. I want to hear their voices about American democracy, because if we all believe in kind of universal values, then it should be a two-way street.
I wish we could go on because I'd love to talk to you about exactly the kinds of vision you have that are visions that are emerging in your place about the future of democracy, which I'm concerned because I think globally democracy is just pretty in terrible shape. And we have to make some extraordinary changes, including, at the level of the United Nations. I think, Putin has turned over the chessboard, and now the things that weren't working very well before clearly are not going to work at all anymore. So we agree
on that. And my colleague, Larry Diamond, who just spoke here, just talked about the 16th year of democratic recession we're in the world. So, but let's come back. Let's do that another time. And I can introduce you to some of my other colleagues who are even more expert than I.
Give my regards to Larry.
Okay, I will. All right. Thanks for having me.
Okay, it's been fun. Bye. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, sometimes more. This is episode number 486. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get there, look around because we have conversations there about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine. You can buy a single copy or subscribe for $20 Canadian per year through Pressreader. Just go to pressreader.com on your browser, and in the search bar, enter the word peace. You'll see the cover of the current issue and buttons to click to subscribe.